Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Rylands Lunchtime Seminar Series. My name is Stefan Hans here from the John Rylands Research Institute and Library at the University of Manchester, and I'll be chairing the session today. The Rylands Lunchtime Seminar Series highlights the breadth and quality of our unique special collections and showcases world-class collections-based research activities. And today's session is coming to you from various rooms, both in the historic John Rylands Library and across campus. And as usual, we will be showing some of our outstanding artifacts and presenting new research on them. So our seminar today is entitled Translation, Teleology and Technology, Digital Humanities Studies of the Ancient World. And before I'm going to introduce our speakers in a second, there are just a few things worth mentioning. First of all, this event is being recorded, it will be edited, it will be made available on the John Rylands Library YouTube channel, and auto subtitles are available using your own settings. We are using a Zoom webinar format, so this means that both your camera and your mic are going to be disabled on entry, and at the end of the session, there will be around 10-15 minutes for questions. So if you would like to ask one, and as always, I very much encourage you to do so, please make use of the Q&A function. These will be then selected by me as the chair and conveyed to the panel. So yes, please make use of this opportunity. So without further preamble, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We'll be joined today by Dr. Kamran Karimullah, who is a lecturer in Islamic thought in the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures at the University of Manchester, and Dr. Hamoud Ubaid, who has worked on Greco-Arabic studies and digital humanities projects at the University of Manchester since 2015. Among their many publications are Kamran's 2021 journal article, Islamic Law, Medicine and Public Health, 800 to 1800, his The Emergence of Verification, Tahqiq in Islamic Medicine, and Orient's 2019, and Hamoud's Topicality and Representation, Islam and Muslims in Two Renaissance Plays. Presenting with Kamran and Hamoud is our very own Charlotte Hoare. Charlotte is the Manchester Digital Collections Coordinator at the Rylands. So this means Charlotte is coordinating processes for imaging, metadata creation, and import of researcher-generated content. She is liaising between the library, project leads, and the university to ensure that the creation and ingest of content is managed efficiently and that images and metadata adhere to great standards. So thank you all for talking to us today, and over to you.
Is it sharing the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, hello. Thank you, Stefan, for your introductory words. Today, my colleagues and I will be speaking about a manuscript held at the John Rylands Library since at least 1901. It is a copy of the medieval Arabic translation of Galen of Pergamum's On the Usefulness of the Parts of the Body. Galen, arguably the most influential physician in history, wrote this book in Rome between 162 and 175, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, for whom he served as the personal physician. On the Usefulness of the Parts of the Body was probably Galen's most famous work, and the one that left the deepest and most enduring impression on the religious thought of medieval Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It is often listed as a book on anatomy, but such a classification obscures the fact that Galen's own aims were, as we might say, theological. For Galen was not at all coy about the fact that he composed the book under the order, as he says, of some divinity, and as he says, sacred discourse, and a true hymn of praise to the Creator, which he identified with nature, who, as Galen claimed, fashioned the human body in the best possible way. The text began life as an argument from design and was read as such in its afterlives in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. On the Usefulness of Parts is a fine example of how knowledge about the human body and nature was bound up in an era in which, in social life, medicine, philosophy, and religious faith were bound tightly together. In medieval Islam, these threads were bound still more tightly. The intellectual energy that Galen's On the Usefulness of Parts stored up was released by a translation of the book by the collaborators of the Christian physician and translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who is justly regarded as the greatest translator of the 2-century program of scientific and philosophical translation sponsored by medieval Muslim society's social and political elites and centered in medieval Baghdad, the political capital of the nascent Abbasid state. Hunayn's extensive record of the translations of Galen's works he made during his life makes it clear that On the Usefulness of the Parts was received in Islam as effectively a work of natural theology that sought to demonstrate the wisdom of the Creator. The afterlife of On the Usefulness of Parts in Arabic was long. There is ample evidence of continuous interest in the text's message in Arabic until at least the 17th century. Abu Bakr al-Razi, the famous physician in the 10th century, Miskawayh, the famous philosopher in the 11th century, Al-Ghazali, the famous theologian and jurist in the 12th century, Ibn Nafis, the famous physician and philosopher, and Musa ibn Maymun, the very famous Maimonides in the 13th century. A copy of the text preserved in Madrid is dated to the 12th century. Another copy dated to the 13th century is preserved in Paris. The National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland has a copy dating to around the 17th century. And evidence from the John Rylands Library Codex suggests that the book changed hands at least once, possibly twice, over a period of 4 or 5 years, also in the 17th century. All in all, we have good evidence that Galen's message resonated with people living in the Islamic world over many centuries. Eventually, Galen's texts were eclipsed by books on anatomy by later Muslim authors such as Ibn Sina. But the fact that Galen's book continued to be copied in the early modern era speaks to its enduring value among Muslim scholars and physicians. The way Galen was read in modern times changed dramatically. Modern medicine rejected Galen's humoral pathology, and by the 19th century, Galen's works in Arabic and Greek were read far more by philologists and intellectual historians and classicists than by physicians and surgeons. At around the same time, the John Rylands Codex of the Arabic on the Usefulness of the Parts of the Body arrived in England from the Middle East in around 1830, where it joined the extraordinary manuscript collection of Lord Alexander Lindsay, the Earl of Crawford, before the entire collection was purchased for the Rylands Library by Enriqueta Rylands in 1901, and now the book's afterlives continue today in digital form. My colleagues will soon speak more about the manuscript itself and the digitization process. It is my task to make some remarks about some of the broader implications of digitization on how we engage with and think about manuscripts and other ancient artifacts in the digital era. In what remains, I want to consider the following pair of questions. What kinds of knowledge do digitized manuscripts afford? And what kinds of sociability do digitized manuscripts create? The anthropologist Tim Ingold urges us to switch metaphors when we reflect on what we know and how we know it. We should, he says, think about our knowledge as embodied motion rather than in terms of representational content. Knowing, says Ingold, is like hiking on a path rather than packing more and more representations inside the head. Put this way, knowing is not classificatory, totalizing, or synoptic, but storied, open-ended, and exploratory. If knowing is a form of embodied moving rather than intelligible, immaterial containing, perhaps we should think of texts not as repositories of knowledge, but as coiled springs that, when read, spur us into action, or like dancers tensed and waiting for the music. Reading results in knowing with greater expertise and sensitivity to cues in the environment and a greater capacity to respond to these cues with judgment and precision, Ingold says. Reading a text according to this way of thinking is not about increasing the quantity of data in our minds, but rather the quality of our knowing becomes more refined, and we become more attuned to how what we know relates to our context and connects us to the world. Knowing, on Ingold's view, therefore, is moving in a characteristic way whose possibilities and limits are prepared by living with others. Our knowing happens in the company of other knowers and past knowers, whose motion spurs ours along paths they have prepared. Manuscripts such as the one we're speaking about today embody this sociability of knowing. They show too how knowing is motion in space and time. Reading, especially reading manuscripts, generates two kinds of knowing in the reader, or two kinds of readers, we should say, two kinds of knowers. There is the knowing that is characteristic of the reader-seeker. From the perspective of this kind of reader, engagement with On the Usefulness of the Parts of the Body has the capacity to generate motion in us that enhances our attunement to the links we draw in thought and action between our bodies and nature, just as Galen had wanted us to do. Readers who engage with On the Usefulness of the Parts as seekers are open. They permit themselves to be vulnerable to having their perspective and attitudes towards themselves transformed, so that they act, feel, and experience their bodies as artifacts and nature as the artificer. From the perspective of readers, curators, reading On the Usefulness of Parts generates knowing that is directed towards the language of the text and the codices that preserve it. Language and codex are the material, socially constituted substrates that deliver, like the spring, the motion to readers. Readers who engage with the language and codex of the manuscript as curators receive a motion that directs them towards the properties and makeup of, in effect, the spring itself and the metal it's made of. Readers, curators, permit themselves to be vulnerable to having their perspective on their place in society, language, and history transformed by reading. Readers, curators, who read the John Rylands manuscript are led in a way to act in a way that exhibits a heightened sensitivity to their links to the past, to the Orient, to the era of European colonialism, and their location in Manchester in the northwest of England. When we read books, we are invariably partially seekers and partially curators. We seek to be transformed by what we read, and our curatorial interaction with the language and the book itself shapes the message we're seeking, and the book's social embedding affects how our reading transforms us. Digitized manuscripts limit our interaction with the artifact to the visual range. The feel and texture of the codex, the sound and even the musty smell of codices, hundreds of years old, being opened, is eliminated. Curatorial knowing is reduced in part to visual perceiving. Traditional curatorial knowing also involves attunement to social and historical context, gleaned from the reader's experience of the reading location and how the reader reached there. A 17th century Arabic manuscript copy of a translation of an ancient Greek text plucked from its original social context in the Middle East and transported to another location in the John Rylands Library in the city of Manchester, in England, in Europe. Digitization swells the potential readership well beyond those who have access to the John Rylands reading room. Readers from almost anywhere in the world can read the message the codex encodes. Yet these readers do not share a sociability grounded in the fact that they share the space of the reading room in the John Rylands Library in the city of Manchester with the common life experiences that come from such shared living. The sociability afforded by digital manuscripts is tenuous, as it is not based on bodies and minds living in proximity. Rather than a site of shared life experiences, Manchester becomes merely a node in a global network. Readers engage with the text in different spaces separated by potentially thousands of miles. Shared life experience is limited to a common ability to read Arabic, and the ability to use a networked computer and an internet browser. Readers become nodes of experience themselves, tenuous and ephemeral, whose spatial distribution mirrors the global network over which the digitized images of the manuscript are shared instantaneously. In conclusion, digital manuscripts are characterized by their limitless duplicability, instantaneous shareability, and intangibility. Reading them yields forms of knowledge that favor this reader as the seeker, the reader who seeks transformation from the message. The reader curator, the reader whose concerns lie in the physical and social constitution of the language and the codex, is limited to what can be visualized and imaged on a screen. The sociability that engagement with digital manuscripts creates is networked and nodal, isolating and ephemeral. Digitization of manuscripts, therefore, is only the first step in seeking to understand some of the ways, in some way, the forms of knowing and living that these manuscripts created in pre-modern societies so long ago, and finding creative ways to make their afterlives flourish today. And now I turn to Hamoud Obaid to tell us more about the manuscript and the creation of the transcription. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamran, and thank you also, Stefan, for the nice introduction. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about my first-hand experience with the manuscript. I've spent a few months now working on the transcription of some parts of the manuscript into digital form, and I will focus in my. I'll share my screen if you don't mind, Kamran. Okay, yeah, there we go. Right. In my presentation, I will focus on points that have already been mentioned by Kamran, the manuscript as an artifact and the manuscript as a carrier of text. So manuscripts are carriers of both cultural significance and textual significance, as mentioned by Kamran. Looking at this manuscript conveys a lot of information to us, both by looking at it as an artifact and by looking at the text it carries. So some questions might arise about what significance this manuscript carries if we know that, for example, there are 3 more manuscripts around the world that have the same text in them. And this is the first part of my presentation. We are looking at the manuscript as an artifact. So the manuscript carries a huge amount of information about the culture, the time and place in which it was produced. There are many sources of these information in the manuscript. This can be the paper it is written on, the ink that was used, or the hand or the script that was used also in the manuscript. In the case of our manuscript here, we have very interesting aspects like the seals on the manuscript. There are 3 different places where the seal of someone called Abdul Hussein Muhammad Rumman is used, and this is, I'll talk about this later. It could be the seal of ownership or seal of ijaza, what we call in Arabic ijaza, which is like a license. We have also the coat of arms of the Biblioteca Lindisiana, the library of the Earl of Crawford, who owned it for a period of time. There are also paratextual elements in the manuscript, and by paratextual, as the name suggests, we mean elements outside the text, and these can take many forms, most prominent among which in this manuscript are a waqf statement, which is a religious endowment statement. The word waqf in Arabic means a religious endowment. Basically, this is bought by a woman called Khadija. This is what you see in this first picture here. And the statement says that she has bought this and kept it as a religious endowment for her children, for her male children, for their perusal. The word waqf means it cannot be sold or used for any other purposes. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, next to the seals, there's an ijaza or a license saying that this book has been taught under my supervision, and this is the stamp of the person giving this license to someone. He taught someone called Muhammad Muwaffaq this book, and he gives him a license to perhaps teach it further or use it in medicine. Another important aspect in the manuscript as an artifact is its marginalia. What we find in the margins is often very telling and carries a huge amount of information. And as you can see from this image on the screen, the book has been given quite wide margins on all sides, which indicates it was meant to be used for teaching and revision, and these margins were meant to be used for annotations, remarks, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have had a lot of marginal notes or perhaps use as a reference or a notebook. And we find that most of the margins are used for their actual use is corrections and additions. An example is in the following slide. If we look at the text here, you find in the margins, there are two words added. The first one is a correction. We have the word yajma' here, which is corrected to jami'. So there's a mistake in the transcription, and it is corrected in the margin. In the second example, the scribe who's working on this manuscript made a mistake. He only wrote the first part of the word here and continued to the next line, then found out that, and he added the missing part of the word here. So the word is as-sina'at. He only wrote the first part, as-sina, sorry. So all of this, as I mentioned, are all of these are very important aspects that give the manuscript its importance as an artifact. But moving on to the text that it carries as a vessel of the text we are interested in, the book contained in the manuscript is On the Usefulness of Parts, or في منافع الأعضاء. And it consists of 17 chapters called books. We focused on books 1, 16, and 17. They hand, book 1, the hand, book 16, the nerves, arteries, and veins, and book 17 is like called an epode, or a prayer, concluding prayer, or an afterword. The methodology we've been trying to follow here is to collate this manuscript with another more reliable manuscript, which is held in Paris. The Paris manuscript is considered by scholars, especially Emily Savage Smith, as a more reliable source for the text because of its completeness, because of its clarity, and other factors. So basically, we use the Paris manuscript as a reference to make sure we get the correct text in the John Rylands manuscript, because the scribes made quite a lot of mistakes, and the handwriting wasn't always on par. And there's also a doubt in my mind that some of the scribes, because there are 3 different scribes, I think, some of them didn't really know Arabic. They were just copying the text. So this is the Paris manuscript, and it's quite interesting in showing us how Galen Jalinus was treated like an Islamic scholar, so to speak. He was described as Jazahullahu khairan wa ghafara lahu. So after his name is mentioned, the prayer following the names of sheikhs or scholars in Islam is used to described Galen Jalinos. We also, in terms of collation, we depended on the scholarly edition, critical edition, produced by Emily Savage Smith of Book 16, which was quite helpful. So the Paris manuscript was used, as I mentioned, to make sure that we get the correct version of the text. These are examples of the same parts of the manuscript from Paris and John Rylands. As you can see, those of you who read Arabic can see at least the John Rylands manuscript here on the left sometimes ignores the dots, which dotting is ignored, which can be quite confusing. It uses a lot of shortcuts in the script, which also can be confusing, while the Paris manuscript is much clearer and easier to follow. Finally, I would like to talk about some observations we've noticed that we have come to as a result of doing the transcription and collation. The text in the John Rylands manuscript is not 100% complete. There are some missing parts in it. There is also quite a few mistakes made by the scribes, but they are also interesting for study and research. This example here, you find that there are 3 types of mistakes in this example made by the scribe. For example, the first one is قلنا أن في هذه الآلة روح نوري مضر ثانية. So there's a misreading of this word. يأتيه is read as ثانية. So the first type of mistakes we come across is this type of, which is misreading of the stem. The second problem is that the word Nuri is written across 2 lines, as we have seen earlier. This is wrong in Arabic. One word should be on one line. And in both of these examples, the Paris manuscript helps us fix the problem. However, both of them have a grammatical mistake, which we fixed that in our digital edition, noting that we have made this change. So this should be ruhan nuriyan, not ruh nuri. This is the correct way of having these words in Arabic. There is also a very important feature of interest in the John Rylands manuscript, is that there is a mismatch between this manuscript and Paris, which is considered to be more authoritative, in the fact that there are around 4 folios of the text in the Manchester manuscript that do not follow the same order as the text in the Paris manuscript. This actually requires further investigation and philological research to make sure or to find out which of the 2 texts conveys the correct order of the text as intended or as originally intended by Galen. That's all from me. I hope you found this interesting. I personally found it really exhilarating, and I loved working on this text. Now I will hand over to Charlotte.
Thanks very much, Hamoud and Kamran. I will just share my screen. So, hi, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the platform that the digitized version of this manuscript and its associated research data will be published on, hopefully at the end of June, all being well, which is Manchester Digital Collections, or MDC. And as Stefan mentioned, my role is in coordinating the many different digital collection and digital edition projects that we work on with MDC. These projects are really collaborative and involve working closely with researchers, curators, and many specialist technical teams across the library and the university. It's very much a multi-specialist skill endeavour, and it's been great to work with Kamran and Hamoud on this particular project, and quite a luxury for us to be able to focus our attention on a single manuscript. Quite often we work with very large collections of material and all the challenges that brings with data management and coordination. So I'll give a little bit of background to the platform and how we support digital humanities research, and then share a few previews of the digitized manuscript on our non-live MDC staging site. But beforehand, I should give proper credit to my colleagues, Arania Karapazia, Digital Metadata Specialist, and Tom Higgins, Senior Software Developer, who have worked closely with Kamran and Hamoud on the digitized version of the manuscript. And I will be attempting to represent really some of their work. And also thanks to Curator of Global Manuscripts at the Rylands, which includes the curation of the Rylands Arabic Manuscripts collection, Zofi Buda. So MDC is a relatively new platform. It was initiated as a project with significant investment from the university in 2018. And the platform launched just before the first lockdown in early 2020. The platform was built in collaboration with Cambridge University and built on the open source code of their own platform, Cambridge Digital Library, which some of you may be familiar with. And we still have a very close working relationship with Cambridge and a wider consortium on the ongoing development of the platform through that open source code. So MDC is for all of the university's digitized heritage collections. It's led operationally by the library, but we have involvement from Manchester Museum and the Whitworth too. As some of you may know, there's a long history of imaging expertise and digitization at the Rylands, and we had an existing and still have an existing digital collections platform, Luna. But the development of MDC was driven quite explicitly by a number of research needs. So the need to provide a platform for increasing digital humanities activity, to enhance our digital collections by aligning them more closely with scholarly research, to make our collections as open and accessible to as many people as possible, and to foster an environment of collaboration, both locally, nationally and internationally. I won't go too much into pitch mode for MDC. I think particularly it's really nice to be invited to be critical about what we're doing with digital collections as well. But essentially our offer is in essence to enable researchers to explore and interrogate the wealth of digital content from the university's heritage collections, to contribute to and enrich that content, and to utilize innovative technologies to disseminate research to academic and public audiences. So without getting too technical, when we're building a digital object on MDC, really we're talking about many different elements and types of data, and that's whether we're working with manuscripts or maps or natural history specimens. So the key ingredients shown here, as you might expect, are of course the images and the associated metadata, which is encoded according to an XML standard known as the Text Encoding Initiative, or TEI. And in the middle, we have what is called the manifest. Again, without getting too technical, is really a linking file between the metadata and the images and defines the structure of the digital object on MDC. So we're dealing with a lot of data at any one time on MDC, and we have to be careful, of course, about things like version control and unique identifiers. So this is the manuscript as it currently stands on our non-live staging site. And you can see here the side-by-side display of the images, the closed codex and the descriptive metadata. So on the left, the ultra high quality images are of course taken by our expert imaging team, and credit to senior photographer Tony Richards, who digitized this particular manuscript. We deliver our images through an international image sharing standard called IIIF, which provides a lot of standardized functionality. but also allows images and associated metadata to be interoperable across many different viewers and used in different ways. And for the metadata displayed on the right-hand side, as I said, we use TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, which does offer a rich framework and quite open framework for encoding information about the material, which creates structured data, which can be interrogated by humans and machines through computational methods. So what we see on MDC is the display end of the underlying image data and item metadata. I'll just show you what that looks like beneath. And I should say that the TI record, which includes the transcribed text and the image information and metadata, is downloadable for each item on MDC. All of our images are also downloadable, and the majority of them are available through Creative Commons licenses as well. So here you can see the image data, which is encoded in the facsimile element of the TEI record, and perhaps more intelligibly, here you can see an extract from the TEI record where descriptive information about the manuscript is encoded. And you can see here elements that you might expect, like title, language, and author. And this underlying data can also drive functionality for the item. So you can see the language here encoded as Arabic, a right-to-left script, and that enables right-to-left navigation on the site, which you can see at the top here. So you can navigate through the digital codex as you would the physical from right to left. One of the perhaps more obvious advantages of the digital is that it allows you to explore the object in ways that might not be possible with a physical manuscript. One example is this deep zoom functionality, which allows clearer visibility of features such as this ownership seal. MDC also allows supported navigation through the metadata. See here, and it's a very tiny arrow, but you can see the descriptive metadata field, the seals here, and through the hyperlinks for particular folios, you can navigate to the corresponding image that is being described. And this is what that looks like in the underlying TEI record. So this is the element for seal description, and you can see particular attributes being marked up with controlled vocabularies, but it's this particular locus element that allows you to define particular images to link to the description, and that creates that hyperlink functionality on the site. And of course, MDC allows the side-by-side display of images and associated transcribed text. And you can see here Hamoud's transcription of the first folio of the first book here. And again, all of this data is captured in the TEI record. We had some technical considerations here around the correct rendering of Arabic script. We have only worked with English language transcribed text previously, so it's nice to be able to add in this support for the future. There are lots of possibilities around marking up transcribed text quite deeply according to quite granular textual categories, as some of which Hamoud mentioned, such as corrections, omissions, and abbreviations. And this can inform different displays of the text on the digital platform. We have some examples of this in some of our digital edition collections. And finally, I just wanted to show some of the possibilities around what might be called digital research environments. So through IIIF, again, we can use different image viewers like Mirador, which is the example that I'm showing here, to create different environments that might be suited to different kinds of research. So if an item is digitized and made available through the IIIF standard, I can view the same images and associated metadata for that item in any viewer that supports IIIF. And this allows you to take advantage of functionality in different viewers. So for example, image annotation, different views, whether that's a more of a book reader view or a scroll view, depending on the format of the material. And as is shown here in the Mirador viewer, side-by-side comparison of digitized items from different repositories across the world. So in this case, we have the Rylands manuscript on the right, open to the first page of the first book on the hand, and the Paris manuscript that Hamoud mentioned on the left at the same opening. So there's opportunities for that direct comparison, but obviously physically would be more challenging. So I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the more technical considerations behind the scenes of digitizing manuscripts and making them available on our digital platforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamran, Hamoud, and Charlotte. Such an important manuscript, such important reflections and theoretical reflections on digital humanities, cultural expertise, a very important and great project. Thank you very much. I'm going to summarize some of the questions that have come through already, and I encourage everybody to ask more and to use the Q&A function if you wish to do so. There have been a few questions about textual transmission of this particular manuscript and the ways. I mean, there was some mentioning of grammatical mistakes, of user marks from 17th century. So the ways we can use such details really to contextualize users, scribes, and textual transmission, and how we can visualize this digitally as a form of sociability of knowing, as an emerging knowledge along the path, if we want to work with Tim Ingold's metaphor. So the broader question is textual transmission, and do we know more about who has copied from whom, describes context, and so on?
I'll begin, but Hamoud will probably have to fill in for me. What we do know is that the original translation was made in the 9th century. It was probably made by Hunayn ibn Ishaq's collaborator, who was also his son-in-law, Hubaysh, and that there may have been 2 versions of this text in existence, or at least 2 partial versions. What we have, the remaining, there are 5 total manuscripts in existence that we know of. One of them is the Manchester one. There's another in Baghdad, another in Paris, another in Madrid in Spain, and another in the United States at the National Library of Medicine. What we know is that all 5. No, what we know is all 4. That four of the 5, excluding the one in Iraq, transmit the same text, more or less. But what's interesting is what's really interesting is the difference in care that's given that the copyists gave. The early manuscripts from the 12th and the 13th century, the Paris, the Escorial and the Paris manuscripts, show a great deal more care by the copyist. The Bethesda and the John Rylands manuscript, they seem to have been done in a bit more haste, and it's possible that they were done by non-specialists in medicine. The number of technical vocabulary in this particular text is extraordinary, given all of the physiological and anatomical things that are required. And this would have been particularly challenging for a non-specialist copyist. According to Emily Savage Smith, it appears that the John Rylands manuscript this requires further research, but may have been copied from the Paris manuscript. But there is a roughly 500-year or 400-year difference in time between the two, and it would be very difficult and very speculative to say how exactly their relationship was without at this very sort of preliminary stage of the research. it's difficult to say much more about that. It seems that the ownership, obviously there's quite a difference in space and time, very likely, between these two. They must, if it's true that they were copied, one was copied from the other, it would have to have been in some large urban setting, possibly in Baghdad, maybe even in Cairo. We don't know. We don't know the Crawford's. I'm not sure if Crawford's records from where he picked his different manuscripts as full. That would give that full sort of view. Hamoud, if you have anything, just anything further to add, please.
You've covered pretty much everything. Something I could possibly add is that there are quite a few interesting features, as I mentioned, which would benefit from further research and from more general research into not just this manuscript, but really the field of Arabic and Islamic manuscripts needs a lot of research really done. There are several attempts, and people have tried to create databases that contain these different seals and try to connect them. This will give us, I'm answering the point about transmission. This would give us a very good idea if we could link these different seals to the period they were produced in, and who studied this text, for example, under the supervision of whom, and so on and so forth. There's also one point that I think I disagree with Mingana over. Mingana is the person who did the library's index. He mentions that the seal on this manuscript is a seal of ownership, but I think because of the ijaza or the license that precedes it, it very possibly could be a seal of the teacher approving the holder of this book to become qualified in this book itself. So it's the owner in this case would be the person being licensed, really. So all very interesting stuff. It would be very interesting to know who Khadija is, who the woman who bought it and gave it to her children as a religious endowment. As I said, all of this would benefit from wider research in the field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are two further questions. One quickly is about the role of paratextual elements in the translation of scientific manuscripts more broadly within this early transition from classical Arabic and Islamic knowledge, and the role of translator and such. So what's, I guess the broader question here would be the significance of this manuscript to reconsider the use of paratextual elements in classic Arabic and Islamic scientific manuscripts. I guess that's also for Hamoud. And then there's another question for Charlotte after that.
That's a good question. And what happens when you're doing for a text like this, where there's a Greek, where the Greek text exists already, there's the paratextual data, so the sort of the data around the text, so to speak, is used primarily by classicists and philologists for corrections. So that the metadata is seen as the paratextual paraphernalia, you might say, is used and is valued because of the value of the text itself. Typically speaking, in this sort of in the philologist's worldview, right? So it's usually not the case that philologists value the paratext as such. However, there are scenarios in which there in the transmission of scientific and philosophical texts, the researchers are interested in the margins, in the marginalia, because they were either copied by, because they seem to preserve unknown text and from other works. And so in that sense, the paratextual information is again a bit more important. Again, but from the philologist perspective, only because of the lost text or the text that's unknown. The curators, the people who want to know these texts sort of as a part of like they tend to focus on the marginal corrections and as well as the copyist notes and the ownership statements, the awqaf. But it's not the case, unfortunately, that the two are often talking with each other. The curator and the intellectual historian are not always talking with each other, which is, I think, an unfortunate situation.
Thank you very much for this. And the final question for Charlotte. So usually you work more with a bigger group of items in one collection. Could you say a bit more and share your reflections on the experience of focusing on a single object in MDC? What did that mean to you? What has been possible to focus on, which otherwise wouldn't normally be possible?
Sure. And like I said, it has been a really nice example of a project where we have had, I think, more time to focus on the needs of one particular manuscript and show that due care. I think quite often we're dealing with collections where we're working with data in bulk. So perhaps we've got hundreds of items in one collection. And therefore our processes are more, particularly with the metadata, quite often we're exporting metadata from perhaps at a distance, obviously still within our own standards. But I think what happens when you're focusing in on a TEI record for one item, and you're having more collaborative conversations, I would say, more focused conversations with researchers like Cameron and Hamoud, is you can really push the possibilities of TEI. TEI is a very open schema for capturing information about particular items. And often when we're working at bulk, we're talking about kind of core metadata. We're thinking more about how we can navigate that collection from a distance in terms of browsing, filtering across hundreds of items. Whereas this time we've been able to had a bit more time to focus in on describing in more detail and capturing in more detail in the TEI record all that you can capture about this particular manuscript.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to the speakers for the presentation, to all of your audience questions and comments, and as always to our tech team. We are going to meet again next week on the 6th of June. Please join us for Benjamin Pope and Tony Richards' presentation, The Making of the Cranach Workshop's copy of the Armorial of Bianca Maria Sforza, Rylands German MS2. You can find, as always, you can find more details about this on the What's On page on the Rylands website. There's also an Eventbrite link to use to register for this event. And yes, again, thank you all very much. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you all again the 6th of